Now, I shall enjoy telling you about the lives of elegant and exceptionally wealthy gentlemen like myself, who enjoyed the best of everything and generally lived to enjoy a port-sodden old age. And I'll be telling you what the other 94% of us who were downstairs were getting on with while they were living the life of Riley.
And between us, you'll end up with a slightly better idea of what really went on upstairs and downstairs, and occasionally in my lady's chamber. Our part of the world's positively awash with wonder-filled country houses. But in this series, I'll be looking less at the art and architecture and more at the rich folk in their castles and the poor folk at their gates. To illustrate my point, I've come to Rockingham Castle to teach you about the myths and misconceptions of the medieval feast. The gradual growth of the role of women in domestic service during the later Middle Ages.
Would you mind kindly shoving off? Some of us have work to do.
And I'll use it to show you why a butler's called after a bottle. Hey, it's not a bad old part of the world we live in, is it? And one of the things I particularly love about this region is the history of the great castles and grand houses, because you can trace their development from fortified castles down to luxurious country houses. And what I find particularly interesting is that you can also trace the change in the relationships of the people that lived and worked in them. They go from one extreme to another in the space of a mere 1,000 years. Rockingham Castle was built by the Normans because William the Conqueror and his chums had a shrewd eye for using commanding ground to nail down their newly won territory. So by the early 1070s, the Saxon folk in this part of the world were under no illusions that they were under new management. I think you're probably getting the general picture here, aren't you? That Rockingham Castle really dominates the entire landscape for miles around, just looks out over the Welland Valley. And that's probably why the Normans were attracted to this hilltop position in the first place. But of course, in those days, it was forest. Now, in almost every reference you ever see to medieval forest, they always want to put the adjective dense in front of it. But you can't hunt in dense forest, or not very easily. Medieval forest wasn't the sort of thing you see in Robin of Sherwood, you know, wall-to-wall trees as far as you can walk in 20 days. Medieval forest wasn't hugely unlike this. It was blocks of very large tracts of woodland, separated by massive areas of open heathland, not cultivated, but just left rough. And they would hunt the game from one covert or woodland to another. And the king and his retainers and his soldiers and his servants all riding out to go hunting, because that was one of the main reasons that they came here, the hunting in Rockingham Forest. And remember, that's not a dense forest. Next to the model we all made at school illustrating the bog standard Mark I Mott and Bailey Castle, complete with power-assisted drawbridge, central locking and an optional surf-driven, climate-controlled Great Hall. Oh, wow. Oh, this is rather tasty, isn't it? It's a very elegant Elizabethan dining room with what looks to be the original panelling and those wonderful painted, gilded mottos that they were so fond of putting on the roof beams. But you know, if you were to strip all this out, you know, take off the panelling, knock out this wall, I bet you'd have pretty much what was left of the original medieval Great Hall, which was twice the length that you see here, 110 feet long. It was the great communal living area, the place where everyone ate, conducted business, and bedded down in amongst the straw at the end of the night.
Shall we be seated? Sorry, we've only got the one servant tonight because I've given the rest of them the weekend off to go and take part in the peasants' revolt. Oh, Eleanor, please take that and give a quick grasso for me, please. You see, a medieval meal, whether it was for a king, a great lord, or even just a humble knight, was always served with a maximum of pomp and ceremony. You see, they didn't simply eat for sustenance, they ate to demonstrate their power and their prestige. That's how the whole social structure worked. The people down below looking up to the people above, the people in the middle looking up to the people at the top. And this was an occasion, a showcase, to show the sort of person you were, how far above everybody else you were. I don't know why I'm pretending to drink from this, it's 18th century. Anyway, the point is, this is where servants came into their own in a medieval household, because to serve a meal with the requisite amount of dignity that the gentry and the aristocracy demanded required and relied on huge numbers of servants. And I'm not talking about, you know, busty wenches bustling about the place with tankards of ale like something from the Hofbrand house. We're talking about people who were almost the social equals of the people they were serving, the higher up the pile that you went. So people would come in, for example, the steward would serve the wine to the lord and the lady.
Sewer, Bryan, I think.
Yes, Basil, thank you, you're right, you're absolutely right. I don't know, never get a guide to work as an actor for you. Anyway, the point is, there were all these divisions in the household. Sewerers, people who were responsible for the cutlery, the butler who was responsible for all the food that was brought in. It was a wide range of jobs. And the fact that people were part of a household meant that they were on an inside fast track to doing well in society, because they could use it as a springboard to raising themselves further up the social pyramid. That's why the household of a great man, a magnate, or even the king, they would wear his livery, they'd even have the family badge on their sleeve. This was a source of great pride. There was nothing servile about being a servant in the Middle Ages. People would kill to get an opportunity to be in amongst the household. And that's the essential difference between the Middle Ages and the Victorian period. In Victorian times, servants were almost considered to be a breed apart, a separate species. In the Middle Ages, it was very, very different. This doesn't feel very clean. It's a lovely dream, isn't it? But then, if truth be told, I think I actually prefer living in the 21st century with all those little inventions that have made life a little bit safer, like sewage facilities and dentists, the NHS and antibiotics and any one of a number of things you could list, not least the fact that given that I've got asthma, I'd have probably died in childhood back then. Sobering thought. I imagine it was a sobering thought when somebody brought the news to King John's servants that they'd managed to lose their master's treasure while they were crossing the Wash. King John, like virtually every other medieval monarch, spent his entire reign travelling all around the country from one royal castle to another. And when a royal monarch travelled, when any great man travelled, they carried everything with them. Their beds, their plates, their furniture, and of course, their treasure. And 3 weeks before he died, King John's royal entourage was travelling across the Wash with guides who didn't know their business. And all of the wagons and most of the treasure was lost when an incoming tide overtook them all. Gone forever. Now, they say that John had left a treasure chest here, maybe the one, and so the story sprung up that the treasure was hidden for safekeeping somewhere in the grounds.
Rockingham was regularly used as an occasional royal residence for 300 years, right up until the end of the reign of Henry V. But by the beginning of the 1500s, the castle was starting to look a little bit down at heel.
Well, Rockingham went into ruin really because the kings needed it far less. They were more and more resident in London, Such civil strife as there was, like the Wars of the Roses, don't seem to have affected this part of the world. And so by the reign of Henry VIII, the castle had been allowed to fall into disrepair. So much so that although there was a constable appointed to the castle, he seems to have done very, very little about it. And the local gentry were ransacking the place for stone for their newly developing country houses.
When the chubby chap in the skirt, that's Henry VIII to you and me, finally decided to sell it off, the castle changed hands for the one and only time in its history.
In 1544, Edward Watson slammed the door shut on his old house in Liddington. Do you like that? Words in action. Don't know how I do it. And moved himself and his family and the entire household into what had been a former royal hunting lodge down in the park below us, below what was then the semi-derelict ruin of the royal castle of Rockingham. And he began the long, slow process of restoring it, of changing it from a once magnificent royal castle to an even more magnificent 16th century up-and-coming gentleman's residence. More of which after the break.
Bryan's upstairs and downstairs, where, as ever, you'll hear something of what life was like, really like, for the gentlefolk and the labouring folk who lived in the country houses of this part of England. By the early 1600s, the Watson family was very much at home at Rockingham Castle. They'd spent the previous 50 years modernising the castle's antiquated and outdated facilities.
Things like the brew house and the bake house, the game larder, the kitchen, the bakery, they were all situated in what became known as the street. Now this is almost a unique survival of what castles used to be like, packed like some sort of shanty town with all the things that needed to be done to keep the family and the household running smoothly. The thing that you would have noticed in Tudor times is that there were far more female servants than there ever was in a medieval castle. It's a great myth that there were lots of women in medieval castles. There weren't. The only women in a medieval castle, because it was a fortress, would be the lord's wife and her own attendants. All the other jobs, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing up, the source of some of these servants astonishes me. All these jobs were done by men. And this was one of the great changes that came in as people abandoned castles and began to live more luxuriously and more elegantly. They needed more servants, and women were brought in to do the jobs. See, servants, when you need one, they're never around.
In time, of course, not seeing your servants was what every master and mistress aspired to. Slowly but surely, the servants were hidden away from their betters,
At the same time, there begin to be divisions within the household, so that there is a servants' hall, for example, rather than all of the household eating together, as in medieval times, in their large hall. So the servants are banished to a servants' hall. There begin to be back stairs constructed so that they are kept out of the way, rather tidied away, as one might say, as they go about their duties.
In the summer of 1642, England descended into civil war, and Rockingham Castle was caught up right in the middle of it. And that's hardly surprising, because the owner in those days, Sir Lewis Watson, had been a real hard case, hardcore royalist. No one, but no one in this largely Roundhead area was going to believe him when he said, "I actually don't want to be involved in the fighting." And in 1643, he and his family found themselves besieged by the Roundheads. After the very briefest of sieges, Sir Lewis throws in the towel, and the Roundheads move into Rockingham. He's welcomed back to the Royalist camp with the memorable words, "Sorry, dear heart, you're under arrest." Now, this is a bummer in anyone's book. However, he must have been something of a smooth talker, because as the king's situation grew increasingly desperate, Sir Lewis manages to persuade him that he should be allowed out to fight the king's corner. And so he's restored as the first Lord Rockingham. At the end of the Civil War, the king having lost, Sir Lewis pays a huge fine of £5,000 to Parliament in order to get his home back. And what a sad day that must have been when he returns, because the home he grew up in, seen built around him, had been all but destroyed. He spent the next 5 years of what was left of his life trying to restore something of the former glory of Rockingham. He never lived to see it restored.
But the castle itself remained in the Watson family, and by the mid-1800s, Richard and Lavinia Watson had transformed the house into a wealthy and well-appointed Victorian home. They also moved in fashionable and literary circles, and a regular visitor to the house on the hill was Charles Dickens. In fact, the great man himself often gave private readings to his friends.
He says to Sir Dudley, "Today is a special day. Today I will announce that my daughter, the beautiful young Lady Dedlock, will have your hand in marriage."
Of course, while the Watsons were upstairs, enjoying themselves, entertaining their friends and relatives, below stairs there was a small platoon of servants servicing their needs. And of course, that was pretty much the case in every great house in England, except in some of them, they were working extraordinarily long hours, doing very hard work for almost no money at all. You see, in Victorian industrial England, it actually wasn't the mines or the shipyards or the factories that were the biggest employers. It was domestic service. And every 10 and 11-year-old innocent who entered service in a place like this would very quickly start to dream of the day when she would be the housekeeper in her own separate suite of rooms, or he would be the butler in his pantry below stairs.
Excuse me, son.
The butler who was cock of the walk, who ruled the roost downstairs. And have you ever wondered why it's called the butler's pantry? Of course you haven't, but I'm going to tell you anyway. You see, this is a medieval screen's passage, and this is a medieval screen. And up above it, there would have been a minstrel's gallery in the days when there was a great hall here. But of course, the screen was here to separate out the swan-like and elegant world of the gentry and the aristocracy, who filled their times doing whatever took their fancy, with the world on the other side of the screen, the world of the likes of you and I, who would be stripping in and out here with dung all over the boots and straw in their hair, coming through these two opposed doors from the fields into the courtyard of the house, so that we never took our smells and our commonness into the great hall, except when we were invited. And on the other side of the screen's passage, there are always two doors. The pantry. Now that's from the French word pain,
for bread. And it wasn't just bread that was stored here, it was any of the dry goods, the numerous dry goods, which a big household needed on a daily basis. And over here was the buttery. That's an English corruption of a French word, bouteillerie, which we actually use the word bottle. And of course in here were stored not just bottles, but huge hogsheads and pipes of wine. There would have been barrels and casks of ale and any other wet goods that was stored in jars or bottles. Gherkins, pickled onions, you name it. If you could sort of preserve it, that's where it went. And both of these connected through to the kitchens. And on high days and holy days, feast days, all the platters were brought through from these two doors, through this one, and into the great hall for the feast. Now, the man in charge of the bouteillerie or the buttery was known as the butler. And for reasons I've never been able to find out, he ended up inhabiting the domain of the pantry. And that's why it's called the butler's pantry. And of course, as head of the below-stairs household, he was the one you definitely did not want to upset. But of course, somebody else you didn't want to get the wrong side of was the valet. You see, the valet was in daily contact with the master, dressed him in the mornings, undressed him and put him to bed at night, was constantly at his beck and call throughout the livelong day. And a word to the wise in the master's ear from himself here could scupper your chances of a successful career in this household. So everybody did everything they could to butter him up. And of course, he, like many another valet, wasn't above abusing his position in imposing himself on the younger and more foolish maids in the house. So, morning, Mum. So what with the butler and the valet and the housekeeper you have to keep the right side of, life below stairs could be very complex and very worrisome. And just to make matters worse, in this house, the Watsons had a cook with ideas above her station, for goodness sake. She even has a sign outside the kitchen door saying, "No person, whether belonging to the family or not, is ever, under any pretext, to enter the kitchen without obtaining leave. Ring the bell." We'll see about that. Jumped up flaming parlour maid. Do they know who I am? Come on.
Cook's compliments, sir. Now would you mind kindly shoving off? Some of us have work to do.
She's a saucebox, that one. You mark my words, she'll end up dancing the Newgate jig. Throughout their history, you know, the Watsons seem to have made the decision to deliberately turn their back on the courtiers' unseemly scrabble for power and prestige. This family stayed rooted here at Rockingham, hedged themselves away, living small and living quiet with their servants. And they've managed that for the best part of 500 years, keeping their heads down, surviving, getting by. And I have to say, you can never be certain on just a short visit. But everything I've heard from the people who work for them seems to be that they enjoy the same sort of close-knit family feeling that would have existed on this site in the Middle Ages. So fair play and good luck. Next time, I'll be attempting to break the European record for the kitchen-to-table soup run and attending an extravagant banquet, not in the Great Hall, but in the attic of one of the most impressive houses in Norfolk, Blickling Hall.